Good evening again and welcome. I'm Mary Lee Kiernan. I'm the President and CEO of the YWCA Greenwich, and we're so grateful to have you all here for this important discussion. I think we have some other people that'll be joining us because there's a bit of traffic out there tonight. But again, thank you for being here. This year, the YWCA Greenwich is celebrating its centennial, and our mission of eliminating racism and empowering women is just as relevant, maybe more relevant today than it was 100 years ago. And with that mission comes a responsibility to speak out about injustice, which is why we are proud to tonight take a look at labor trafficking and honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, along with 35 other partners around this community. Before we begin, I want to recognize some very special people and say a few thank yous. I know that First Selectman Peter Tessie intends to be here at some point. Oh, you are here. There you are. Peter, would you like to come up and say just a few words of greeting? Thank you so much.
Well, first, I just want to say good evening to everyone and a real immense sense of gratitude to the YWCA for hosting tonight's program. It is in keeping with your mission, and it also is in keeping with the enduring activities that you carry forth throughout the year, which all fulfill the mission of the YW. And so I just want to extend my appreciation and thanks for hosting tonight's program, which we hope we all will benefit from and work to eradicate. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. And I also want to mention that State Senator Alex Bergstein is going to be with us at some point, as well as State Representative. Oh, there she is. She's everyone's appearing at the same time. Thank you for being with us. And I know State Representative Fred Camillo is going to be joining us at some point as well. I also want to acknowledge our Police Chief, Jim Heavey, who is here with us this evening. Chief Heavey is an important partner, of course, as the YWCA Greenwich works in this community on domestic violence and, of course, as we work on human trafficking as well. Next, I do want to thank all of our community partners. As I mentioned, there were 35 of them tonight, nonprofits, community organizations, town departments, and houses of worship who partnered on this event this evening. Their logos are on the screen here, and we appreciate their leadership, their efforts to share on social media and with their constituents about tonight's event. And I do want to thank the law firm Holland and Knight in particular, who gave us a donation to cover tonight's costs. So thank you so much. I want to mention also several other community partners that are with us who are specifically working on human trafficking in our region. Elizabeth Koldyke-Bobel is from the Partnership to End Human Trafficking. This is a local organization that is working to develop a shelter for trafficking victims and provide a way out for them through social enterprise. Claudia Connor and Jessica Suarez from the Connecticut Institute for Refugees and Immigrants is here. Their organization, which turned 100 last year like us and was actually founded by the National YWCA organization, is working tirelessly to support immigrants and refugees and survivors of not only human trafficking but of torture. This card, which is out on a table outside, produced by their organization, is being distributed throughout the refugee and immigrant communities to raise awareness about human trafficking and how they can receive help, how victims can receive help. And so this is outside as well for you. And I want to acknowledge Catalina Horak from Building One Community in Stamford. They are also helping the immigrant population in this region to find work that is safe and pays a fair wage, as well as other services to support vulnerable populations who fall prey to traffickers. Now, last year, in partnership with the First Selectman's Diversity Advisory Committee, we helped develop a guide, a resource guide for immigrants and new members of our community, which surprisingly didn't exist. And in this, anyone can find information about skill building, workforce development, health care, child care, domestic violence, legal assistance, and so forth. And this is also outside for anyone to pick up. It's available on the Department of Human Services website, our website, in English and in Spanish, so this is really an important resource for new members of our community. So let me turn to our topic for tonight. What would Dr. King have wanted us to focus on as we mark his legacy? And he would have cared deeply about human trafficking, we believe, also known as modern slavery. It's a global phenomenon that, according to conservative estimates, claims over 40 million victims worldwide. It attacks societies in a variety of forms, including sex trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, child marriage, and the forced enlistment of child soldiers. The numbers are staggering, and they're not just the burden of poor, underdeveloped countries. The United States and Connecticut are not immune to these crimes. And we know this quite intimately here at the YWCA because we know we have served victims of human trafficking in our Domestic Abuse Services Department. Now, last year we focused on sex trafficking, and several of our panelists were with us last year. And before we dive into this year's discussion of labor trafficking, I do want to give you a brief update on what we discussed last year. So last year you learned that sex trafficking is often conducted on the internet and on the dark web. And we discussed at length the website called Backpage.com, which was particularly egregious in its efforts to exploit women and girls and children by facilitating their sale through its website. And through the efforts of law enforcement and prosecutors and lawyers like Vincent Napo, who was with us last year, that site has been seized by the federal government and has been taken down. Its owners, its founders, its management were all indicted on 80 or 90 counts of prostitution and money laundering in federal court in Arizona. So that's the good news. But while there was initial drop in ads following the shutdown of Backpage, the drop was short-lived and new sites have popped up. And it's estimated that about 146,000 online ads are now being posted each day in the United States on leading escort websites, more than before Backpage was in business. So there's still much more work to be done to address this chronic problem. And we're going to follow that trial of those founders of Backpage, and we want to keep you informed of that as it moves forward. Also last year at this event, Senator Blumenthal spoke about SESTA, the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act. It was known as FOSTA in the House of Representatives, and it passed. That is the good news on a bipartisan basis, and it was signed into law last April. And that closed an important loophole in a federal law known as the Communications Decency Act that made online sex trafficking sites immune from civil liability for actions of its users, like traffickers putting up ads. And it also clarified the federal sex trafficking law to make it illegal to knowingly assist or support sex trafficking. So this provides sex trafficking victims with greater ability to sue websites and gives prosecutors the ability to hold companies like Backpage criminally liable. So that is more good news. And we do have a message this evening from Senator Blumenthal because he cares so deeply about human trafficking. So we're going to look at that now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Blumenthal, your U.S. Senator and a fellow resident of Greenwich. And I am truly sorry that I am not with you in Greenwich. I'm in Washington, D.C., to honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in this very profoundly important discussion of human trafficking. First, I want to thank the YWCA for hosting such a tremendously significant event. Dr. King believed in fighting for the basic human rights of all people. He received the Nobel Peace Prize, but he was a fighter for civil rights and liberties. And he knew, and we should remember, human trafficking is a form of slavery, holding individuals against their will, demeaning them, and denying their right to liberty. It's a scourge that must be eradicated. Human trafficking creates an estimated 27 million slaves worldwide. In fact, it reflects one of the largest criminal enterprises in the world, with profits estimated as much as $150 billion annually. Victims of human trafficking are robbed of their dignity. In some cases, they are deprived of their lives. Survivors need and deserve services to help them recover and reclaim their lives. America can and must do more to address human trafficking. As your United States Senator, I can pledge to you that I will continue heeding and helping in any way to eliminate human trafficking in this Congress. I'm particularly proud in the past Congress to have been an original co-sponsor and a leader of the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act. It's known as SESTA. It allows victims of sex trafficking to seek justice against websites that facilitate this abuse. It gives law enforcement officials the tools to bring enablers of these crimes to justice. This measure, SESTA, is a significant advancement in the fight against trafficking, but it needs to be followed by much more. Many more steps are important. We need to bring transparency to temporary worker visa programs to ensure that United States employers cannot use the legal immigration system to traffic in people. And we need to hold US-based corporations accountable for labor trafficking in their supply chains. That kind of measure ensures that big US companies cannot profit from slave labor and look the other way. Trafficking occurs in virtually all communities. And so everyone should do their part. They have to remain vigilant to instances of trafficking, whether it is in a fast food restaurant or some other public place. Learn how to determine if a person is being trafficked. Look for the telltale signs. And today's event, very importantly, reinforces the YWCA's commitment to human dignity and to enabling everyone to be a foot soldier, as Dr. King liked to call it, in the quest for justice and the fight against human trafficking. I'm honored to be a part of this significant event. I hope that we can keep an open dialogue on ways forward to rid the world of human trafficking. And once again, thank you so much to the YWCA for facilitating this important discussion and to recalling the words of Dr. King, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. It ought to resonate with all of us. Thank you for your dedication and your support, and have a wonderful event.
So now let's turn to tonight's topic, labor trafficking, and our wonderful panel. The ILO, the International Labor Organization, estimates, as the Senator referenced, over 20 million people worldwide are in forced labor, including children. Labor trafficking generates $51 billion in illegal profits from forced economic exploitation in a variety of industries, which we'll learn about tonight, in the products we purchase and the food that we eat every day. So tonight we're going to talk about the complexities of this issue, what law enforcement is doing or not doing, what the private sector is doing and not doing, and how you and your families can help end labor trafficking. So on your seats is a program. On the back, there's a list of warning signs you should look for in someone who may be a victim. There's a list of services and also a list of important resources for fighting human trafficking. At the end of our discussion tonight, we'll have time for Q&A. We'll address your questions. There are cards on each of your seats and pencils and pens available, and we look forward to hearing from you at the end of the discussion. And lastly, I just want to point out there's a survey on your seats, and filling that out, we would really appreciate it if you would do that. So now let me turn to our outstanding panel, and I'll go from my left to your right to my left. First, Resa Spaziani is a supervisor for wage and workplace standards at the Connecticut Department of Labor. I just learned that she's been there for 29 years, she told me a few minutes ago. In her role, Resa enforces laws that support worker rights, like minimum wage and overtime laws, wage payment laws, and laws outlining prevailing wage rates, as well as working conditions. The Department of Labor also inspects businesses for child labor violation. She also heads up the Stop Work Unit. She works with multiple law enforcement agencies on job sweeps who rely on her to assess violations, interview employees, and make real-time decisions that enable law enforcement to charge businesses with crimes and lock their doors. And presently, they have issued an excess of 3,000 stop work orders, and annually, the DOL inspects more than 6,000 businesses across the state and recovers more than $6.5 million in employee wages. We also have with us tonight Jillian Gilchrest. Jillian was here last year as well. She was recently elected state representative for Connecticut's District 18. Congratulations. And prior to her election, Jillian served as the Director of Health Professional Outreach at the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which is the YWCA's and the state's umbrella organization for domestic violence providers. She's also the former chair of the Connecticut Trafficking in Persons Council, known as the TIP Council. This is a statewide council comprised of representatives of state agencies, nonprofits, and service providers who study human trafficking in this state. And the council also makes policy recommendations to the General Assembly to prevent trafficking, protect and assist victims, prosecute traffickers, and those who buy those unlawful services. And Jillian, you should know, played an important role in the anti-trafficking legislation that was passed in this state in 2016. Divya Demato is CEO and co-founder of GoodOps, a supply chain transformation company that helps organizations innovate through advanced technology solutions and sustainability frameworks. Divya brings deep expertise from partnering with senior leaders from Fortune 500 companies to high-growth venture-backed startups. For more than 15 years, she has worked with a diverse range of global and iconic companies, including Walmart, Kings Lane, and PriceSmart. And she believes supply chains are the fastest way to change the world. Through her groundbreaking innovations across a wide range of industries, she's been able to change the lives of many workers and implement more environmentally friendly business practices. Ambassador Louis deBaca is a lawyer and formerly served as the United States Ambassador at Large to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. As a federal prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, Lou led investigations and prosecutions of dozens of forced labor and sex trafficking cases involving hundreds of victims. And in addition, he has guided policy efforts that led to the development of the modern victim-centered approach and victim protection, such as the T visa. And this enables certain victims of human trafficking and family members to remain in the country while assisting in an investigation or prosecution of human traffickers. Lou is also responsible for the promulgation of the U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the United States Anti-Trafficking Protocol. And our moderator, Krishna, who was with us last year, Krishna Patel, is the General Counsel and Director of Justice Initiatives at Grace Farms Foundation. She is a former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the state of Connecticut. As Deputy Chief of National Security and Major Crimes in this district, Krishna worked with federal agencies to investigate and prosecute a broad range of federal criminal cases, including national security, cybercrime, human trafficking, child exploitation, and more. She created one of the first court-monitored restitution funds for victims of human trafficking in this country and for foreign victims, and she has received numerous awards for her work. And since joining Grace Farms, you should know she's been at the center of organizing actions against human trafficking in this state, including the law that I mentioned earlier that was passed in 2016, and in helping law enforcement deploy innovative data platforms to do their work. Krishna is also the leader of an initiative called Unchain, which is a media campaign developed to generate awareness of human trafficking and galvanize funding to disrupt and eradicate this crime. And we're going to take a quick look at a video about Unchain. So why don't we welcome our distinguished panel with a round of applause. And I'll hand it right off to Krishna.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. And thank you to my incredible panelists for being here, many who I know extremely well. And I do want to just really thank the YWCA. It's really amazing that they've made such an extraordinary commitment, and Mary Lee in particular, for all of, not just for doing this every year, but I am so fortunate to live here in Connecticut, where I see a small but very potent group of people who every time we call to get anything done always show up and bring with them an incredible force and a grassroots initiative where I feel like we continue to be the state where I believe Connecticut can be the first state that is slave-free in our country yet again. So I thought what I do is start just very quickly talking a little bit about just the numbers. While they're imprecise, I do think they're important to give you some sense of the data. I know we have a slide on this, and it might just be helpful to give you a visual. These are numbers that have been put out in 2016 and 2018 by Walk Free and the ILO in something called the Global Slavery Index, where an attempt was made for the first time to actually give some data to this. And so these are probably, I think, the most precise. But having said that, a lot of this data came not including countries where a lot of conflict happens, where we know there is a lot of slavery. So at any given time in 2016, 40.3 million people were enslaved. Of that figure, 71% were female and 29% were male. And what you're seeing there, the redder the area, you're kind of seeing more of the hot spots. And so we look relatively clean. And that should actually scare you, because we actually, and we'll get into this, know that we're not clean, that we have a lot of slavery that goes in. But compared to the rest of the world, we seem pretty okay. Just 24.9 million in forced labor alone. And on the bottom there, those are the 5 most at-risk products that are being imported into the United States and into the G20 countries, so into what I'll call the global north. So you're looking at the tech industry, computers and laptops, the garment industry, the fishing industry, cocoa, and sugarcane. And we'll just quickly take a look at the next slide. And so to give you some context, you hear trafficking as a modern-day slavery or trafficking is the second largest criminal industry worldwide after the narcotics industry. And you hear the number 150 billion in criminal proceeds. What that number does not include is the fact that if you just took at the G20 countries alone, if you looked at the import of at-risk slave-made products, just the top 5 at-risk slave-made products, you're looking at $354 billion worth of consumption by the top G20 countries. And of that, the United States is consuming about 144 billion. So basically, we, the global north, are the consumers of the products made and rooted in slavery in the global south, right? And so with that, I guess my thought to all of you is, all of us as individuals, as consumers, as people, I think it's fair to say we all enjoy services and products at the lowest possible price, right? I mean, how many people here want to overpay or want to pay more for anything? But my question to all of you is, anytime you've paid for a product or a service, how many of you have considered that the person behind that product or that service could be someone who's enslaved or someone who's been trafficked? Has anyone here actually ever really believed that when they bought a garment or a piece of fish at the store or a piece of chocolate, that the person behind that at any point could have actually been enslaved? Yes, no? And of those people who believe that, has anyone ever reported it? Any hands? Okay, all right. And I know those two. So I'm not surprised. So we have at least 2. And so I'm going to start with Lou. And I'm going to start by saying Lou might not want to own this, but the reason I've gotten involved in this work for about 15 years is because of Lou. Back in 2003, Lou was still not so famous and was a prosecutor in our Civil Rights Division, just starting this work when nobody talked about human trafficking. And that's when I got very inspired and very engaged in doing this work through a U.S. Attorney's Office. But so I guess my questions to Lou are, how did we get here? Where these are the kinds of numbers we're looking at? And why is it that as a society, we don't seem to want to look at labor trafficking?
Well, I think that there's a few things, and you know, a lot of it comes back to why we're here this weekend. You know, the idea of Martin Luther King choosing for the March on Washington for Jobs and Equality to open his iconic speech with a grounding of what civil rights, what human rights in America were 100 years after emancipation. It was almost 100 years to the day after the Emancipation Proclamation was first issued by President Lincoln, making it very clear that the Civil War was a war about freedom. And Dr. King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and he basically characterized the 13th Amendment as a promissory note that had never been cashed. In fact, when the African American community consistently would present it at the Bank of Justice, the Bank of the United States, it kept coming back as insufficient funds. And I think that that's important to think about, because it shows that both self-satisfaction of the United States for having ended a system of legal slavery that it had itself created, so we shouldn't necessarily congratulate ourselves for stopping doing something horrible. But at the same time, this notion that civil rights, justice, and economic justice, which is what the March part of it was, all have to be thought of as inseparable from that promise of emancipation. So what does that mean then more than 50 years after the March on Washington, as far as the economic and the social legacy that Dr. King ends up leaving us as he challenges the country to cash that promissory note once and for all? And I think that part of it ends up being that we have to look at all of this bundle of rights, whether it's economic rights, whether it's social rights. You know, you can call it anti-discrimination, you can call it equality, you can call it all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, we're talking about people who are safe and secure in their own bodies, in their value, in their membership in groups that are excluded and vulnerable. And the reason that I wanted to kind of highlight that is because I think it actually, on a very existential level, maybe goes to your question, Krishna, which is sex trafficking, especially sex trafficking of children, strangely enough, is a bit more comfortable of a topic than is labor trafficking, because you don't have to confront the contradictions within our own society, within our relationship between capital and labor, with our relationship as consumers ourselves. And you don't have to stop and think, who's picking our fruit? Why are the same farms and the same fields where people are being abused by crew leaders now, yelling at them and beating them, maybe in Spanish or in a Central American language or in Creole, are the exact same fields that African Americans were enslaved in the South 150 years ago? And how is it that a place like Connecticut, which even back then prided itself on being a free state, but made an awful lot of money manufacturing the shackles, manufacturing the slave garments that were sent south, and consuming the things that were sent north? And so just as those people who framed the 13th Amendment, which was a beacon of freedom for the United States and the world, I think gave us something to aspire to, it's also a challenge, I think, which is just as Connecticut, circa the eve of the Civil War, wasn't necessarily as pure in its relationship with the commodities, as pure with its relationship with the effects of forced labor as it maybe would like to think, so too none of us are untouched by this. And I think that that is an exhibit A as to why folks would probably rather not confront labor trafficking, because to do that, you end up having to look into yourself in a mirror in a way that being active on sex trafficking, you can say, well, I don't go to strip clubs, I don't go to prostitutes, I don't use child prostitution or anything like that, so I'm fine. But if you're saying that wearing clothes, if you're saying that carrying a cell phone, if you're saying that having eaten anything in the last 24 hours, then you are somebody who needs to think about it. Now, we're going to talk, I think, about solutions as the panel goes on, and everybody has solutions. We shouldn't think about it and become immobilized in the face of this huge global problem, because there are things that we can do and that everybody can do together. But I think part of the first thing to do in the spirit of Dr. King is to actually look at not just the places where we've fallen short, perhaps, where the promissory note has not been cashed, but the places where we can work together to actually achieve that dream that he announced that day.
So, Divya, we know that we have the consumers, we know that we have governments, but we know that businesses are a really important part of this conversation. And you're someone that has a lot of experience, and I just want to say the company that Divya works is a co-founder of. She co-founded with her husband, Richard, who's here. It's called GoodOps, and there's a small group of us that thinks it should be rebranded as GreatOps because they do some really amazing work. And I think what would be very helpful is, there is an opaqueness. Slavery is in every supply chain. There is an opaqueness that businesses take advantage of, right? And as consumers, we can look and have a willful blindness or just a blindness about it. But can you talk a little bit about the global supply chain and maybe even give an example, for example, like the Ethiopia example, of what it takes to go through an entire supply chain, the complexity of it?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for letting me be here today. Super excited. I think in general, there's actually a lot of parallels, I think, to what Lou was just talking about and for the consumer that's also happening with business owners. There's sort of a level of, clear conscience that, even if some companies are taking the first step in protecting maybe their immediate suppliers and saying, we have taken these precautions and we know that our supply chain, as far as we own it, is slave-free. But in reality, most of these supply chains go very deep into second, third, and fourth tier suppliers that provide a lot of the raw materials or other elements of the supply chain to make these goods. And so the tricky part in supply chain and for business owners is how deep do they really want to go? Because when they start to ask those questions and start to discover what's further down, what are they willing to do about it? How does that actually impact their profits and their business? So specifically, Richard and I and our company GoodOps, we were working with a fashion brand based out of Nashville, Tennessee, so an American brand that is all about empowerment of women through work. That's their tagline. They source from around the world, from India, Ethiopia and Africa, and then also in South America. And they also even have a shop a jewelry shop in Nashville as well. And so we were tasked from the CEO, which is predominantly who we work with, is the CEO or COO. And he said, listen, I know these suppliers that I'm working with, which are predominantly female entrepreneurs running supply chain operations in these different countries, but I'm just not sure what's really happening. I don't know truly if I'm de-risked here and if the statements I'm making from a marketing perspective can really be backed up. So Richard and I, our company, was tasked with developing, the right framework to do a proper audit, which means what are all the different elements of the business that we need to start tracking from both three areas: environmental, social, and governance. But on the social side specifically, we broke it down to really three major areas. It was around wages, safety, and equality. And of course, there's a series of questions that go within the audit. And then what we did was we actually went in country, on the ground, and met with every single supplier and met with every single worker and interviewed them with a local translator to basically get real information, what's really happening. And ultimately, and we'll talk more about it, but there was sort of what I call the tale of two suppliers that are worthy of discussion. And one, I'll say supplier A, who it was clear that there was some bonded slavery happening in their supply chain. And the reasons behind it are mixed. Not every owner of a business has intentions of doing that. Some of these are cultural. Some of these are just the business norms of what they're paying their workers. Other things like loans that are given out to help the worker pay for rent or medical bills, et cetera, and then it creates a cycle of abuse and exploitation. And say supplier B that was getting awards and was fair trade certified and was recognized in the community, and ultimately was employing women that are HIV positive, a very discriminated group that was not getting normal jobs, and yet when we went on the ground, it was essentially a sweatshop. So, going on the ground, taking those steps forward, working with companies and business owners that believe in human rights, and really believe in taking the extra steps to go into their supply chains, is where we get optimistic about what's possible.
So to take it from the macro to the micro, Jillian, and I do, I've served on our Trafficking Persons Council with Jillian for the last 3.5 years, and one of the things I'm very sad about with her becoming a rep is that Jillian's had to resign, but she did such tremendous work on this and moved our state really so forward. And so I really want to thank you for all of your work on the Trafficking Persons Council, but I think a lot of people don't even know what it is. So if you could actually talk about what the Trafficking Persons Council is, and then kind of give us your thoughts on what the most difficult issues are around trafficking here in our state, and kind of what you're taking up as our state rep.
Wonderful. And thank you again for having me for a second year, and to Krishna and the great partners I've worked with here. So the Trafficking in Persons Council was created in state statute in the state of Connecticut back in 2004. Our state recognized that we needed some type of body that would look at the issue of human trafficking here in the state of Connecticut. And so since that time, it has changed in the different members who come to that table. But we have Department of Children and Families, Department of Social Services, Department of Labor, Department of Public Health, the Judicial Branch, law enforcement, advocates. Now we have the Lodging Association, the truckers. So we have a variety of entities that come to the table to study and discuss the issue of human trafficking here in the state, and then we make policy recommendations to the state legislature. As you can hear, I keep saying we. I just stepped off the Trafficking Council. And so to tie this to labor trafficking, two issues in particular that I think are of grave concern here in the state and have been for some time are nail salons and illicit massage businesses. And in hearing my fellow panelists, the issue of nail salons, I'd posed to the group, who's been sitting face to face with someone in a nail salon and wondered, are you doing this of your own free will? And what I explain when I go out is that not every nail salon has human trafficking in the state of Connecticut, but human trafficking is taking place at nail salons. And the business model itself just doesn't make sense. So when you go to get your hair done, you have to make an appointment. You can't just walk into a salon unless it's a Supercuts. You can't just walk into a salon and there are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people waiting to do your hair. When you walk into most nail salons, that's the case. And if you have to wait longer than 10 minutes, you sometimes get upset because it is supposed to be quick. Well, that business model doesn't make sense because it's not above board. And my colleague to my left can speak more about it, and I've learned a great deal from her work. But the Department of Labor here in the state of Connecticut has done investigations, and we know that there is human trafficking taking place at nail salons. And I will speak to that of what we're doing. So in 2016, we worked, in my role as the chair of the Trafficking Council, we worked with lawmakers, and we were only able to get that issue so far as them creating a task force that would study it. Connecticut is the only state in the country that doesn't license nail technicians. And so it makes us a hotbed for human trafficking. We were able to get that task force, but then the task force was never filled. And so they actually never studied the issue, and we're at the same place we were at in 2016. And so actually the first bill I introduced this week was to license nail salons in the state of Connecticut and to institute training requirements, which is a way to move us forward in the right direction. The other issue is illicit massage businesses. At any given time in the state of Connecticut, there are 250 illicit massage businesses. These are those seedy places that you see in a strip mall or on the side of the road and you think, ooh, that doesn't seem right. I wonder what's going on in there. Well, it's human trafficking. And again, because of the amazing colleague to my left, we know what that looks like, and it resembles what we've learned from Polaris, which is the National Human Trafficking Hotline, that it is typically a woman of Asian descent in her 30s or 40s who is being trafficked out of Flushing, Queens, and is moved oftentimes every 2 to 3 weeks to different massage businesses across the state of Connecticut. That's another issue where instead of us looking and being disgusted that that would be in our community, we need to look and say, who is the individual that's inside there? Who is she? And how do we help her get out to freedom?
And I'll just add that we've actually been approached by the legitimate massage industry because they feel so deeply impacted by this, and they don't want to see it continue, right? Because they feel like everyone's just painted with a broad brush on this. So Resa, if you could actually let us know what the Department of Labor's role at the state level is, how you get involved in this, and what are the industries that you see most impacted by trafficking in the state of Connecticut?
So the industries that we see here in Connecticut are no different than they are nationwide. I'm on a panel, it's called ILSA, it's the labor departments throughout the country. The same issue is here that is in South Carolina, that is in California. The industries that we see the labor trafficking here in Connecticut is probably number one, construction. Number two is nail/massage, and number three is restaurants. We also see it in car washes and some other situations that are generally lower paying positions. It has creeped into larger businesses now, which years ago people thought it would never do. So as a unit, as we're the stop work unit, what we do is we do sweeps on industries. So we may this month do construction. Well, it's cold, so maybe not this month construction, but maybe this month we'll do nail salons, and in April do construction. And we sweep whole areas. So one of the biggest things that I hear a lot is people say, well, it doesn't happen in our town. Well, I assure you it happens in Greenwich. We've swept Greenwich. We've had, many, many nail salons. We've had many construction sites. We've had many restaurants that are labor trafficking. And they're bringing the people in from New York. It's probably not your neighbor, I will tell you that. But what they do is they meet in New York. There are many different agencies. And the people line up and they get on the bus and they come here to Greenwich. And Greenwich, Stamford is very easy. It's a short commute. But we see it in New Haven. We see it in Hartford. We see it all over the state. It's more prevalent in Fairfield County because of the logistics. So they load up in a van in the morning and they have to be at that bus stop at 7 o'clock or 7:30. And they come in. And there's usually 8, 9, 10. And this is nail salons, this is restaurants, and this is construction sites. And then they go to work. And at the end of the day, different industries are different. Nail salons, they only get paid for the customers. Construction, they may get a lower rate. Restaurants, they may get a lower rate. But at the end of the day, after working 12 and 13 hours, they bus back to New York. We've also seen many, many times where the employer will have a residence and he will have 8 and 10 people in the residence, in 2 bedrooms, in 1 bedrooms. A lot of times in the construction, they book 2 hotel rooms and they are in the hotel rooms. This is labor trafficking. So anybody that goes into the restaurant and utilizes these services, anyone who's having construction done, anybody who goes and has their nails done, this is all labor trafficking.
What are your suggestions? And is there any signage requirement that is required anywhere in the state of Connecticut?
So I'll jump in first. Yes. Back in 2016, we did pass a statewide law that a variety of entities in the state of Connecticut have to post signage. It's mixed on who is actually doing that, but restaurants, nail salons, hotels, motels, airports, bus stations, train stations are all supposed to have signage that explains what human trafficking is and the hotline to be able to get help. And so if you don't see that signage, you can report that to the Trafficking Counsel or the Department of Labor, and there is a penalty associated with not having the signage. What I tell the everyday person is that if you are in a nail salon or if you are passing an illicit massage business, that you could call, I don't know if he's still in the room, you could call the mayor of your town or the chief of police, let them know you were at a training where you learned about labor trafficking, you think that there's trafficking taking place in your town, and that you don't want the potential victim arrested. That's the way I phrase it, so that it gets the message out there, it alerts the law enforcement, the officials in your town, but again, kind of drives home the point that there's probably a victim in there.
So you can contact the Department of Labor and, say, I always say to people, you're having your nails done. Did you ask? Did you ask somebody, what are you getting paid? I ask, but I'm in that business, but I ask, what are you getting paid? Are you getting paid? People are willing to tell you that. They're willing to talk to you about that. And you can certainly pick up the phone and you can certainly call us. We have our own means to run that company. We can tell how many people are on that payroll. We can tell if they're reporting taxes for those people. Those are big triggers to us. When we run a company and there's nobody on the payroll, yet you walk in and there's 8 people working, or we're on a construction site and there's 8 people on a roof and that company doesn't employ anybody, those are big signals to us. So a lot of times people call up and, well, I don't really want to get involved, I don't want to say anything. But we can tell right off the bat from your phone call if that is a legitimate business. So you don't have to tell your name. We get tips like that on a daily basis. And sometimes they're a disgruntled employee, they're the disgruntled competitor. We know that. We can flush that out from just running that information. If I get a call that Golden Nail Spa has 10 people and I'm looking at their payroll and they have nobody reported, that's going to send an alarm to us. And we are going to go out there and visit them. And if we do go in there and nobody is on the payroll and there's 8 people working, and sometimes we'll send somebody in and try to book appointments and things like that. But if we go in there, we're going to shut that business down right then in real time. So they don't have an option to try to hide that from us or anything else. They are shut down from that moment. And then they have to go straight before they're going to be able to reopen their business.
So if we actually can move back to Divya, you are now an American consumer walking into stores here. 2 things. It's a question I always get is, how do I purchase better? Right? And you hear things about companies, right? And companies do need to worry about reputational risk. But one of the things that I do want to ask you is, when you do these audits and you inevitably find slavery, what is your recommendation to your client about how to handle that in terms of remediation or what to do?
So, first, as a consumer, it's hard, right? There's a lot of information, misinformation, marketing claims out there. We all want to feel good about the things that we're buying, and there's not always a lot of details available. Certifications, we did a massive project where we cataloged something like 450 different certifications and standards out there, things like Fair Trade or PETA or SA1000 and B Corp. It's endless. And, ultimately, unfortunately, they're all a bit flawed, right? A lot of them are self-reporting. Very few of them actually go on the ground. Again, it's also how deep do they actually do the checking? Is it a first-tier supplier, or do they actually check what their suppliers are supplying from? So, what we're finding as far as opportunities is because there's a growing demand from say, the millennials and the younger consumers of publishing and sharing information on their websites and declaring commitments, but also showing, true metrics and true evidence of what they're doing. That's starting to happen. And I think ultimately, because there's now more technology, transparency tools, there are things like blockchain, there are things like IoT, there are things like Labor Link, which is a technology that actually goes directly to the workers and gets survey data directly from workers and things like that to start actually, giving the power to these brands that want to do good and saying, hey, listen, we are doing the work, we are working towards this, and here's the information. So, as a consumer, go to the websites. If you don't see any information on it, write to them. Social media is a great platform. Facebook and Twitter, if you start seeing, these suppliers are not answering questions, these brands are not answering questions, you can start to probe in these sort of platforms, and most companies do respond. As far as, what we advise clients that are looking to see what's actually happening deep in their supply chain, not because they legally have to, but because they know it's the right thing to do, or because their consumers are starting to ask. What we've found is, and it's interesting, I think we were talking about even what's happening with these nail salons, what happens to the worker, right? And sort of being worker-centric or victim-centric in some of these conversations. Some of the tactics that we've taken is, let's start the dialogue with these suppliers first, right? And, one, are they willing to let us go there? Are they willing to open their doors? Are they willing to let us speak to their workers? If they say no, that's a flag, right? And we tell our clients that that's one of the first issues. What are they hiding? And if so, what are the opportunities to actually get sort of past that? What are the incentives that a client can offer that particular supplier? Not just financially, but in terms of, hey, we may freeze our business with you if you don't allow us to go forward. Or if you do open up your doors and let us go in, we will work with you on working on some of these solutions to basically get you there. For the suppliers that do let us in, and we do find actual, abuses and trafficking and sort of forced labor issues, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times these aren't with bad intentions. Sometimes there are sort of cultural norms. But once it's out in the open, once an assessment is done, and there is a standard and a benchmark saying, actually, no, these are abuses, this is not international standards, and there needs to be, some sort of path of correction to actually change these policies and really, implement certain human rights policies for these workers. There's other two approaches. Either the supplier is going to say, wow, this is just what I know, I didn't realize, or maybe I did realize, but I thought that was okay. Either way, I want to work on this, and I will start to make changes. It doesn't happen overnight, but there is a path to that. And in those situations is what we want, right? We want to feel that this is a partnership. We want to have the brand and the supplier involved together. We a lot of times broker that conversation, and we start thinking about what are the negotiation tools that are win-win for both sides. It can't just be about jacking up prices, and it can also be about getting these people out of work. So a lot of times what we've found is, to stop the cycle of trafficking, to stop the cycle of forced labor, a lot of times it's around wages. It's really about empowering the workers and getting them what they need to get paid, and then stopping sort of the cycle of abuse. That is, again, a challenge. What are the operational efficiencies you can introduce? What are sort of the subsidies a brand can potentially offer that supplier on helping to, offset some of those costs until certain efficiencies are in place where they can actually, start paying themselves. On the other side, for the suppliers that are like, which was what happened with one of the suppliers we work with, there was defiance, there was a lack of acceptance of the results. There was threats of retaliation. Specifically, this one company this one supplier that was sort of the darling of the community in Addis Ababa. She had, connections, and she so much as said that she would then go after this brand and make it really hard for them to work in the country. So, in that particular situation, the client was advised to to stop working with this supplier. And there was sort of a phased out approach that actually ended up happening. And so today they are no longer working with this one supplier. But the brand, as well as us, we still think about those workers there, and we wonder what can we do and what are our options, to sort of support these people. Because if it's not us, this one brand stopped supplying from them, but there are other brands that will continue to do so.
So Lou, I do think it's helpful, right? As lawyers, there's a legal definition to forced labor or trafficking. What is it? More importantly, though, as prosecutors, this is a crime. It is a crime. So there are legal implications to it. Can you also talk a little bit about some of the trends you're seeing with the Modern Day Slavery Act in England, with Australia, with what's happening globally, and then what you're seeing happening here in the United States in terms of labor trafficking, and what's working and what hasn't worked?
So definitionally, if you think about the forced labor offense in the United States, it's typically if you obtain or maintain the services of another through force, fraud, or coercion. You can go one step back from that, actually, and fill that in with this notion of if you used a scheme, plan, or pattern to make somebody feel that there was no reasonable alternative but to perform or to continue to perform the services, or harm would come to themselves or to another person. And what's interesting about that is the reason that that is the standard in the United States is because in the law in 2000, we were specifically having to push back on a case from here in Connecticut where the Second Circuit Court of Appeals had basically said that psychological manipulation, telling immigrant workers that they'd get turned over to the immigration service, that they get deported, keeping them in a basically a chicken shack outside of New Haven. All of these things were not enough under the law as the Second Circuit Court of Appeals had interpreted it. And so that was one of the reasons why in the year 2000 we needed this new law. I think that with that framework, and it's the same basic framework for sex trafficking, begging the question as to why there needs to be two different laws, frankly. It's the exact same standard as far as is there a scheme, plan, or pattern, et cetera. The only difference in sex trafficking is whether or not it's a child, then you don't have to prove that there's any type of coercion at all. So in a nutshell, you're talking about compelled service. It doesn't mean that the person didn't want to do that work. You can have somebody who was a hairdresser in their home country, and then they're a hairdresser here. They came specifically to take that job, but then they get caught in that company store debt, that cycle of debt bondage, that type of abuse, wage theft, combined with threats as to what would happen to them or to their family if they were to leave service. All of that, suddenly you wake up one day, and the thing that you had agreed to do is no longer voluntary. And I think that's one of the things that's most important, perhaps, for first responders, is because a lot of people will say, oh, well, I chose to do this, or I did this in the past, et cetera. It's kind of like marital rape or like domestic violence. The fact of standing in front of a church full of people that one day and saying I do does not operate as a legal waiver for everything that might happen at the hands of that husband for the rest of your life. And so I think that that's one of the things we have to think about with the definition. As far as kind of how it happens, and in the United States, in the UK, Australia, et cetera, with these new laws, you've got this kind of twofold thing that's really exciting. And I think there might be a slide on this, but
We do. We have 2 slides, yeah.
it may be that I'm just inventing the fact of there being a slide on this. It's such a good-looking slide, but I can't see it from here to describe it. So hopefully what I'll say is somewhere on the slide as well. It's such an exciting time, I think, at least in the Commonwealth countries, and the only reason the United States is not a Commonwealth country is that we left early when it comes. But the common law countries, I should say. The United States with the California Supply Chain Transparency Act, the United Kingdom with the Modern Slavery Act, and now, as of a month ago, Australia with the Modern Slavery Act, are basically saying that businesses have to take the kind of affirmative steps that you've already heard about, that they have to file with the government what they're doing. What's interesting, the California law was the first one up, and so it had to just kind of introduce the concept, and so it didn't have a lot of teeth. You could actually answer that and be in compliance with the law by saying, we're doing nothing. But then, of course, graduate students and advocates and everybody else would start pointing at you for the fact that you were brazen enough to have that as your filing. For the UK and now Australia, it's something that's much more like what people might be familiar with through the Dodd-Frank Act as far as conflict minerals. Actually having to do these types of disclosures and put it in with corporate governance reflected at the director level as saying these are the things that we are doing. And then again, we can start to test that. There are universities, especially in England, that have been looking at it, and it's slow to come online. And rather than that being a failure, the fact that it's providing a place for the students and the professors to analyze compliance is exactly what the transparency model should do. Because what's starting to now happen is a bunch of companies, as they realize they can't just fake their way through their compliance statements, are having to find good solutions. And they're also looking to see the fact that the auditing solution that they'd been sold throughout the years, often by folks who come out of the environmental auditing rather than the social auditing movement, that don't really know how to talk to immigrants, that don't really know how to talk to vulnerable communities, that are willing to accept what the industry tells them about what's necessary in that particular job site, that they have not been well served by that. It's kind of like grade inflation, where you think your kid's an A student, and it's really because you're going to a high school where you're paying for all of them to get A's. There will become a moment of a reality intrusion, I guess, for lack of a better word. That's what's exciting about the Modern Slavery Act, is that I think that it's basically saying, this isn't normative. If you're a company, and we're not saying that you're bad for having this, we're not saying you're good for doing something about it, we're saying this is just something you should do as a company, which is kind of what's happened with just regular auditing. You don't give people awards for having KPMG or Deloitte come in and do their normal auditing practices in there, and you also don't necessarily punish them when they find things and start to ameliorate it. So I think that that's what's exciting about these laws. But the other thing that's exciting from the perspective of people who do what Krishna and I used to do for a living is the bad guys are going to jail. Because it's empowering companies, it's empowering the governments. The Gangmasters Licensing Authority in England is kind of the equivalent of the Department of Labor. And they, for a long time, like many departments of labor around the world, had always felt like, we know who the bad employers are, and we go to the police or we go to the national police, the FBI equivalents, and we tell them that, and they're all like, oh yeah, that's just a labor issue. That's not a crime. The Gangmasters Licensing Authority in England in the last 2 years has basically been on fire. They are bringing cases left and right. They're pulling Polish men out of car washes where they've been enslaved. They're liberating domestic servants from exploitation. They're finding people in these same places that we see what you've already heard here in Connecticut. It's because that new law empowered them and it gave them the teeth as well. And it's forcing then the folks at Scotland Yard and others then have to take it seriously about working hand in glove with them. That's, to me, one of the most exciting things is how you move past it being labor enforcement is over here and it's a civil money penalty or a slap on the wrist, something that employers can simply write into the cost of doing business. And every once in a while, somebody might get caught for a labor trafficking criminal prosecution, but by and large, everybody's so focused on sex trafficking that businesses don't have to worry about it. If that's how we have set up the human trafficking enforcement regime, then it's like a recipe for labor traffickers to get away with it. And I think that that's what we're seeing with empowering, whether it's ministries of labor or local and state offices, to have those kind of relationships with police and prosecutors. Where that happens, you then end up seeing these cases. The one thing I will say is that with time, even folks that focused exclusively on sex trafficking are starting to see this. The task forces in Minneapolis, the task forces in Texas had been exclusively sex trafficking. That's the only cases that they'd done over the last 4 or 5 years. And the lessons that they'd learned from doing sex trafficking cases actually prepared them when they saw a Chinese buffet in Texas, in Waco, for first arrests in a Chinese buffet case in Texas. It prepared the folks up in Minneapolis when community leaders that were working with the undocumented population came forward with a case of really horrible abuse in the construction industry. It had sensitized them already, the work that they were doing on sex trafficking. And so while it would have been nice that if they'd been working on them both equally from the beginning, I think that what we tend to see is that the trafficking task forces and trafficking working groups will end up seeing the commonalities. And that, to me, is the exciting thing about these new laws. I think that's on the slide, isn't it?
No, that's not on the slide. All of that. Some of that. So one of the things, and Lou's going to keep me honest here, we still, on our criminal prosecutions, or criminal enforcement, I think it's about 90% is still about sex trafficking. 80 to 90% is probably right?
Well, here's what's interesting, and I have to put the caveat on that. What I'm doing is in Connecticut right now is that I'm at the Center for the Study of Slavery, Abolition, and Resistance over at Yale. And so I'm looking at, kind of how did we get here? And if you looked at sex trafficking versus labor trafficking in the 1990s, it's almost exclusively labor trafficking, because that was the only thing that people thought of as far as labor slavery. If it was prostitution, it ended up getting done under a law that said it's illegal to move people across state lines for the purposes of prostitution, which assumed that they were not victims. In fact, it kind of precluded them from being victims. And so under this law, which is called the Mann Act, M-A-N-N, for the congressman that wrote it, you end up having basically 100 years in which the United States exempted people in prostitution from the protections of the 13th Amendment. And so we needed to pull back on that and apply it to everybody. And so one of the things that the 2000 law does, starting with some cases in the mid-1990s, is to say, no, even people in the sex industry are protected by the 13th Amendment as well. I think right now we need to think about where the pendulum is on that, because it may be that the pendulum swang so much that now most people, when they think of modern slavery in America, the only thing they think of is sex trafficking. It's kind of upside down from where we were 10 years ago. The reality is we have to, I think, commit ourselves to finding, helping, and walking towards recovery with people, no matter what it is that they're being held for. And we're a little off kilter right now in the U.S., but I think we've seen folks specifically being hired into the Justice Department in recent months to look at the sex trafficking, labor trafficking disparities. The folks from the community-oriented policing section, the COPS office as it's called, are coming online with a new program to try to train state and local law enforcement specifically on labor trafficking. So I think that there's a recognition. But all you need to know is that in Great Britain, the hotline there, 74% of the calls to the hotline in Great Britain involve labor trafficking as opposed to sex trafficking. In the United States, almost the mirror image. 73% of the calls to the Polaris Project hotline in the United States are about sex trafficking. So it's not just that law enforcement is choosing to do this case or the other. It's, I think, the society, when we are thinking about what we talk about when we talk about trafficking, sex trafficking has very much dominated in the last few years.
And The other stat I'm just going to put out there, which is completely going to support what Lou's saying, is there is a civil counterpart to our Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and that is overwhelmingly 80 to 90% is actually labor cases. So it's just interesting, right, that law enforcement has not had the chance, I think, to really work on the labor trafficking issue in the way that it needs to be.
There's a study that the folks at Northeastern did a few years ago, specifically around the Department of Justice funded task forces, that said if it was the Vice Squad that applied for the federal money, then 100% of what they ended up doing was sex trafficking. Whereas if it was the General Detective Squad or something else, then you'd end up having a very statistically significant difference as far as how much labor trafficking got done. And I think that's part of it, is that the vice squads already existed. They were already doing some of this work. Some of this is that we were relabeling existing child prostitution efforts and kind of slapping the word trafficking on top of them. But I think it's those linkages, especially with the state departments of labor and with others who are out there working with the actual workers in vulnerable communities. That's where we're going to make cases.
So I want to be very sensitive to the time. I know that I want to leave open time for Mary Lee to come up with questions. So just really quick, my last line of questioning to all the panelists is give the audience a recommendation, or give them something to do, or give them some piece of advice in terms of trafficking. And I'll start all the way with Resa.
Well, I think that saying, if you see something, say something is really good for that. Pick up the phone. If you suspect something like that, I can assure you it 95% of the time is exactly what you're thinking it is.
I would say that we need to make this a priority. So that bill is introduced. The pushback's going to be there's not enough funds to support the Department of Public Health to oversee the nail salon industry. We are working to do a coordinated response here in the state with regards to illicit massage businesses, so to bring law enforcement, Department of Labor, and an advocate together so that when they're going to go into an illicit massage business, the three players are there and that victim can have someone who speaks their language, but that's going to take resources. And so obviously Connecticut's in a tight budget time, but where do we currently prioritize our dollars versus where should we be? And so we as a community need to step up and say that this is a priority.
I'd say, ask questions to business owners, right? So, whether you are a business owner, what's happening in your own supply chain, if you know business owners, what are they doing in their supply chain? If you as a consumer, right, and ask what is happening in your supply chain that you are checking for these potential abuses, and asking for this information to be shared. Probably the best thing you could do.
In a place in Florida that had basically at least one slavery case every year for almost 10 straight years, there now have, for the last 6 years, been no slavery prosecutions. And it's because a lot of good businesses, including Walmart and others, are working directly with the workers who are out there as the auditors. The folks who run the program basically say they have 30,000 people on their cell phones out there who are calling in. There is one business that refuses, and that is Wendy's. So what I say is, do with that what you will.
We should talk to every Wendy's in Connecticut. I actually have a very specific project, and I know Bob Tiffin is somewhere in here. So between him and his kids and everybody else, which is, I actually think that we should take the Connecticut tax dollars and ask every high school in Connecticut and UConn, and I would just love to see the UConn women's, particularly basketball team, to begin sourcing at least our athletic gear.
Yep.
So if we could just all as citizens ask every single one of our reps, one's right here, and I know she'll totally agree to this, agree, just the learning exercise of saying we're just going to ethically source just our athletic gear. I think it would be an amazing, amazing project for our state to show the world what can be done on this issue. So I'm going to say thank you to my panelists. I'm going to ask you to hold your applause because Mary Lee is going to take over with questions.
Krishna, just on that point, and I've heard you talk about this, can you and all of you speak to that list of employers and companies that we know about now who ethically source all the way through their supply chains?
So, you know, on the athletic side, so Adidas, everyone will agree with me here, I think.
Okay.
Adidas, they do have one person that's a celebrity that I'm not a fan of. But besides that, Adidas is an amazing company that has really taken this issue on very seriously and has done so much. Nike also, you know, is an amazing company. And I think if all of the state of Connecticut went to either one of them, not only do I think we'd save money, by the way, I think it would make an incredible statement about who we are as a state and what we're starting to do. And I think educate our kids. Nike. So know the change that's put out a report, which may or may not be here. I don't know. So if you look
It's on
up the
program.
chain, they actually they just did apparel and footwear report, and Lululemon and Adidas are actually up there as two. There's also companies on there that I'm sure many of the folks in this room might shop at, but are not very good companies. So I'll leave it at that. Patagonia is probably like the gold platinum standard, right? I mean, people put their standards up there.
Yeah, and it's sort of one of the things where a lot of these companies also, Patagonia is a great example of, you know, the good intentions, and they do a lot in environmental, and so now it's sort of, but how far are they going in the social side, you know? So, but they are starting. These are great examples of companies that are moving in the right direction, and but it is a continuous, I think, evolution for sure.
Unilever, Patagonia. I mean,
Absolutely.
These companies doing amazing work out there, and we see
They're having the conversation.
Right, incredible commitments to actually trying to move all the way through the supply chain, including very complex supply chains. You take a
Yeah.
look at Unilever, that's very complex supply chain.
And just so everybody understands what food products may or may not be ethically sourced or use coerced labor, can you just go through those industries that are the worst offenders?
So in the top three, the chart, the thing you really have to worry about is seafood. You know, we can talk a little bit about this, but cocoa, seafood, and sugarcane are three that you have to worry a great deal about. You know, Pulitzer Prize winning, you know, work on this was actually on the Thai shrimp, right? It's on the Thai shrimp industry. Seafood is really a massive issue in terms of slavery across the board. And chocolate. And I'm just going to ask all of you guys to go to Google in case, you know, I keep coming out with nothing right now, too.
Yep. I think, yeah, I mean, I think that not only those, but, you know, part of it is thinking about kind of what are the hidden ingredients. And the most hidden and probably most prevalent ingredient anywhere that is in almost everything, and it's shocking how many things it is in, is palm oil. Palm oil. And you can be discomfited about palm oil if you're an environmentalist who cares about the cutting down of a giant forest that helps us cool the earth. You can be concerned about palm oil from a sex trafficking perspective, as far as the women that are brought in to basically serve the lumberjacks who are doing that deforesting. The men who are enslaved as the lumberjacks, much less even, in this little story, we haven't even planted any palm oil yet, and enslaved the people who are taking care of and harvesting it. You can also care about it because of the orangutans being on the edge of extinction. So whatever it is that brings you to caring about this, there is something for you, unfortunately, in palm oil. And palm oil is like spiders. You're never more than 5 feet from something that has palm oil in it.
Right.
And I would just add also fast fashion.
Yep.
You know, be really careful when you see very, very cheap products because there's just not enough margin if you really think about, you know, paying all the people that it took to work to make those goods.
So I have several questions from the Mayor's Youth Leadership Council at Stanford High School that I want to read, and the Center for Youth Leadership at Brian McMahon. The first one is for Resa. Can you tell us how many nail salons the Department of Labor investigated in 2018 for wage abuse? and how much you collected in fines, and how many salons you think you will investigate this year?
2018 is kind of hard. We've done sweeps of nail salons where one day we shut down 23 of them. We had 5 different teams throughout the state, teams of 2. So, probably 40 or 50. I mean, I don't, we don't, without our tracking, we don't really know, but we do look at that industry a lot because of the amount of complaints that we do get on that. So, I don't know that we'll have a sweep anytime soon, but we might. So
Okay.
You don't want to tell them.
I can't tell you if we are, but we might.
Okay. Another question is for Representative Gilchrest. It says, as you know, you've submitted this bill concerning the licensing of nail salons, and Connecticut's the only state that does not currently license nail techs and nail salons. So how can you be certain this will minimize wage abuse among nail workers in Connecticut? Really an enforcement question.
So I can't be certain. I think oftentimes we pass legislation and then we don't follow up. So this is one step in the right direction, and then we need to be vigilant and continue to follow up. Having spoke with Resa on numerous occasions, I mean, this is another resource issue. I believe you've told me you could investigate nail salons, construction sites every day, all day of the year. And so now that I've just gotten in, I'm a week in, and I will be serving on the Appropriations Committee, I'm interested to understand where our dollars are being spent and try and figure out how we can prioritize certain things like this, and then best utilize the Department of Labor, the Department of Public Health, and law enforcement, because what Resa has also let me know is that they do collect fines, and so there are fines coming in, and can some of those fines be used to continue to investigate? I think that the bill we're proposing, which we're working on the language, we're looking to try and do a pathway for current employees, because we certainly don't want to unemploy the entire nail salon industry in the state of Connecticut, because that also wouldn't be the solution. But I think by at least having some type of oversight body, like the Department of Public Health, currently someone can open a nail salon and they don't even have to be licensed themselves. And so we're looking at legislation that would require whoever's opening the nail salon also has to be trained themselves and has to go to a certain amount of schooling. And so I just think with these different standards in place, we're going to be able to reduce the amount of fraud that we currently have in the state.
Okay. You mentioned enforcement a couple times, and we heard earlier about how quite often workers are bussed in from Flushing, and then an establishment may be shut, and those workers end up somewhere else. And these are multi-jurisdictional cases in many cases. So to the prosecutor, the former prosecutors here, how can we get after this in a sort of cohesive, a holistic way, and get after the traffickers?
Want to go?
So, one of the very difficult things continues to be that Connecticut does not have a grand jury system of any kind, right? And the reality is, they don't have the ability to issue subpoenas, local and state law enforcement. And I continue to think that's actually really devastating for the state.
We can issue subpoenas.
So, so I'm thinking criminal subpoenas to get, information about phones or credit cards or things like that. But the most effective model is the joint task force model, because it always crosses lines, and we tend to have a robust task force in place, and having that robust, having a task force. The task force gets, goes through ups and downs, but I think having a task force that really focuses on the labor side as well, and gets trained up on that side would actually be really key.
Okay. Can you speak to the issue of domestic servitude and how prevalent it is in Connecticut? What actions are being taken to prevent and prosecute the perpetrators? And I have to say, I received a call this week from someone locally who's very concerned about someone who works in someone else's house who hasn't been paid in years and is working under illegal conditions.
I'll do the kind of overview, and I think Krishna has the Connecticut experience. This continues to be a problem. It's been a problem certainly dating back to the 1930s as far as cases being done. I think it was a problem before that. It's just that no cases were being done. What we've seen, even as of this last week, is that these cases happen in pretty much every community, in affluent, educated communities, as well as places with a strong foreign population. There's a case that just got done the other day in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. A girl that had been sent over from Africa, threats to her parents, and for years, I think 15 years or something like this, had been in that house. They are the hardest cases because the people are not, even like in a sex trafficking case, you have to have that person out where clients can find them. In a labor trafficking case, most of them are working in a farm or a field or some kind of business establishment where they could maybe be seen by a client, even though they might not feel that they can confide. In the domestic servant cases, it often is that kind of, for lack of a better word, the ghost behind the window, that the neighbors may not even see or not know were there. And so I think that one of the things, unfortunately, it's not one of the areas where we can be as proactive. If you figure out who are your scofflaw farm labor contractors over the years through DOL investigations, you can then kind of go in with a proactive investigation using all of the tools of kind of sophisticated criminal law to figure out whether it's time to dismantle them once and for all through criminal things. That's not really something that you can do with a one victim household maid situation with an upper class defendant, because you just don't even know that it's there. Right. So I think that for me, it's always been about prosecutors and police have to be ready to catch when somebody does make it out. And there are usually two ways they're going to make it out. They're going to make it out and then be brought into the system through a service provider, whether it's an immigrant service provider or often the church, who sees it and then brings them forward. Or it's going to be, I was looking at some old files this morning, and I saw a police report from a girl that was arrested in Buffalo back in the day at Walmart for stealing $17.64 of food. And it's because they were starving her. And she got caught shoplifting. And thank goodness that the Buffalo police officer took a moment to try to figure out, why is there a 16-year-old girl from Nigeria who, of all the things that she could have stolen in Walmart, it was a little bit of food, and she wasn't dressed appropriately on a cold winter's day. So I think that part of it is just being ready to see what it is when the person actually does come out from behind closed doors. Krishna, on the other hand, has actually done these cases here in Connecticut. So,
and they are so hard. The largest number of cases we've seen is out of Fairfield County. And I'm going to tell you that, so we've had them, Siri, so Claudia's here from Siri, and Siri actually sits on the federal task force. And the most important thing I'm going to say about this is, I still believe my old office and the ICE folks will work to get them out. What I will say right away is get them out, right? And take the time that you need to stabilize them. I find, and we're in a very difficult environment with undocumented aliens right now, in a very, very, very difficult environment. It was hard before to have them cooperate, but the most important thing I can tell you is I still continue to believe that there's adequate resources in our state to help them get out. And then you could go to wage an hour to get them redressed, even if they're not ready to do the criminal side of things. And so, but get them out, find a way to get them out. Yeah. And there's a lot of people you can talk to do that.
I'm going to do one more question about children. Have there been any labor cases identified in child welfare programs across the state? If so, what kind of labor trafficking are you seeing children engaged in?
I was going to say I had a case involving bakery in New Haven, but Jillian, go ahead.
was going to say that the Department of Children and Families, since they've been focused on working on trafficking here in the state of Connecticut, has actually only identified one child, and they are the first to admit that that is not reflective of what we know is going on in the state. And so actually what Lou was saying, they're going to take the model that they've built surrounding domestic minor sex trafficking and now build that out to go after labor trafficking of children in the state, because we are not there yet.
We've had, the case that we had that is public, I will tell you, it was Rocco's Bakery. It was out of New Haven, and young children actually were involved in that case. We also had another case in a retail coffee shop as well. And it was, they were, again, an immigrant population, and it was an undocumented where it was family, right?
We get quite a few child labor cases like that in construction, in restaurants, and generally it is the relative that is putting them to work, to help the family. And we've had quite a few arrests of the employer for employing the minor, and horrifically, many times the judge doesn't think that that's a big crime and throws it out. So we have done quite a few of them, but with not a lot of prosecutions.
One type of case, and I don't know if it's here in Connecticut, but it's something that we frankly thought was something of the past, and now there's a prosecution going on in North Carolina of one of these cases, is organized around kind of sectarian religious groups. I never want to assign something the term cult, but very charismatic leader with usually a business that goes with it. And so in North Carolina right now, the prosecution, interestingly enough, it's one of the first cases like that that's being done by the state as opposed to the feds, which is a real breakthrough. But what they were doing was they were having the children of the religious community members were all having to work in kind of these famous fried fish restaurants in North Carolina. And it had gone on for 15, 20 years. Horrible levels of abuse. And I think early on when people would come out, people would simply see it as, oh, you're fleeing a cult, or something like that, and not actually then think about the underlying forced labor. So it's something that, again, we thought that this was kind of a little weird blip in the early 80s, and that wasn't happening
we
anymore.
See that.
But you do see it.
We see a lot. So not that long ago, we got a call that the worker from, it wasn't a YMCA, but it was a similar group, YWCA, but it was a similar group where the person actually got out, the child actually got out and wanted to go home. And they were from down south, and they wanted to go home, and they didn't have any money to go home. So they were selling magazines.
Yep.
So traveling around, so the people knocking on your door are selling magazines. They were selling magazines. So they had them all in a hotel. And not all were minors, but some, some were minors. So we actually went to the hotel and started posting on all the doors, stop work orders, so that we could, and passing out cards to everybody. We went, to their morning pep rally and passed out cards and put stop work orders on all the hotel doors. So, a couple, got out, but it was another one where, I have warrants in many courts in the state right now for child labor, and that they're just not getting signed. So, a lot of people don't think. I've had many, many parents call and say, why can't my kid work in the restaurant? I worked in the restaurant when it was my father's restaurant, and why can't my son be on the construction site? I did construction. Well, unfortunately, we get called in when the kid got put in through the wood chipper because he was helping his father. And the kid loses his arm in a slicer because they're helping their parents. That is labor trafficking because they're working to give that money back to the families.
Right. And that speaks to training of the judiciary. Is that what I'm hearing as well, Jillian?
Yes, and another good policy that's passed, but we have to follow up on it and keep now working through the policy, is that in 2016, and that got expanded in 2017, that pretty much any agency you can think of in the state is being trained on human trafficking. And now it's looking at what does that training include,
still long enough.
and how can we continue to build on that so that law enforcement, judicial branch, Department of Labor, Department of Education, again, it really runs the gamut, understand the various types of human trafficking taking place in the state.
But it was unfunded.
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, resources.
Okay, right. So why don't we thank this incredible panel with a